Hey guys, welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking about some fantasy football tight ends. In today's video, we have some guests on the channel in Baskin, Brad, and Halbert. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It really helps my channel grow. And please share with your friends. That also helps my channel grow. I hope you enjoy the video. Hey guys, welcome to the video. We're going to be talking about tight ends and their fantasy impact. Today, let's just get into the video.
Saw Gerald Everett kicking Zach Ertz there. Very inappropriate.
So, tight ends to put on your radar in 2020. Let's start with Brad here.
All right. So I'm going with Mark Andrews. So Lamar last year loved to throw to his tight ends more than his receivers, obviously more than running backs. It was his safety valve that they could just block for him, and then if he didn't want to run with it, just toss it to him. Last year they ran a double set with Mark Andrews and Hayden Hurst, but Hayden Hurst is now in the Falcons. So you're in a system with Lamar, who wants to run the ball and then dump it to a tight end, and also just throw to tight ends in general, with Hollywood Brown, who's injury prone, as his number one receiver, and it just leads to Mark Andrews probably having a good season. So I would draft him, especially a lot of people aren't really noticing him, I would say, in the drafts I've seen. If you can get him later rounds, I would definitely grab him, either as a 10-1 or even as a backup, just to speculate on.
So the way I think Mark Andrews, I feel like his spot, it's just not gonna change. He's probably the around 5, 6, 7-ish best tight end. The people above him, they're George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, and I feel like those sorts of people, he's not gonna be able to pass them no matter how good he is. I feel like where he is now is a proper draft spot. He did very good last year. I think he's gonna do similarly this year. I don't think he's overvalued or undervalued.
Okay, that sounds great. Let's move on to Baskin's pick here with Jonnu Smith.
Okay, so Jonnu Smith is my pick here. And continuing with my sleeper theme, I think Jonnu Smith, remember when Delanie Walker put up 1,000 yards in that offense? I think Jonnu Smith is pretty similar to what Delanie Walker was in that offense. And I think he'll put very similar production of what Delanie Walker did in that offense, with a little bit with Jake Locker, a little throwback, and then Marcus Mariota. I don't know if he played with Locker, but he at least played with Marcus Mariota in that offense. And I think Jonnu Smith is a very similar player. And I think the Titans like to use their tight ends and kind of that format and heavily throw the ball to them. And I could see Jonnu Smith putting up that Delanie Walker-like season. So that's a tight end 4 or 5 or maybe 6 year this year. So I would definitely draft Jonnu Smith possibly as a later pick, as maybe my tight end 1 this year in fantasy.
I absolutely hate Jonnu Smith this season. For starters, he only had 35 catches for 439 yards last year and 3 touchdowns. As my starting tight end,
no, he wasn't a rookie. My bad.
As my starting tight end, I do not want that. I don't even want that on my bench. Plus, he's not going to improve. Ryan Tannehill, we've already talked about. If you check our quarterbacks video out, or you'll already know that we think that the Titans players are going to regress, and I don't think that Tannehill will help Jonnu Smith grow. I mean, he had 35 receptions and 439 yards last season. Those are not fantasy numbers. You can't do much with that on a fantasy league. I just have too many worries about him. I don't think he's a viable fantasy option next season. Let's move on to Halbert and Dallas Goedert. Interesting, he went with Goedert and not Ertz.
Okay, so Zach Ertz, he's one of the best ones. I feel like that's established. But Dallas Goedert, I feel like nobody ever pays attention to Dallas Goedert. He's a great tight end. I feel like he goes undrafted a decent amount. I would spend a late draft pick on him. You don't need to spend too high of a pick. If you either need a backup tight end because you have an injury-prone starter, this guy's perfect. Or if you're trying to just do sleeper tight end and you do this guy and someone else, he does well. He's like Martellus Bennett when he was a Patriot, he did fine, and he just doesn't have games where he completely disappears. I know he's like another receiver for us because the Eagles were lacking there. I just like the pick, and I feel like no one ever talks about it.
I mean, that would be exactly my point. I mean, what did the Eagles get? They got receivers in the draft. They got, what's his name, Marquise Goodwin from the 49ers. The Eagles, the receivers are going to be healthy this year. So I think there's no possible way the Eagles are more injured than they were last year. I mean, half of their roster was injured at one point. Dallas Goedert is only worth picking in fantasy if you have Zach Ertz on your team. So he's worth picking in that scenario, just as Alexander Madison is worth picking if you got Dalvin Cook as a starter on your fantasy team. So in my opinion, Goedert, he doesn't really have that much room in fantasy unless you have Zach Ertz. Then he's a great pick in a later round. But I don't see his production really going up, or it's probably going to go down from last year with the receivers being more healthy this year.
Yeah. I fully agree with that. I fully agree.
Go for it, Brad.
One more point. The only way that I see him being better than some of the other starting tight ends that aren't even drafted out there is if Zach Ertz gets injured. And at that point, you don't want to have handcuffed to a tight end when you could just pick up somebody else. And with the receivers that they have now and Miles Sanders and the rest of the receivers obviously being healthy, I think that he just doesn't have that production even if Zach Ertz gets injured. I think there are better tight ends on the waivers than him.
So I'm going to agree with all of you guys. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but last season, I just looked it up, Goedert had 58 receptions for 600 yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. Those stats are really promising. Yes, the Eagles were basically injured all of last season. However, I think Goedert could still be a good tight end, maybe as a backup tight end in really deep fantasy leagues. If you're doing like a 20-team fantasy league or like a 15-team fantasy league, take Dallas Goedert. I think he could be worth your while. But other than that, if you're in your normal 10 to 12-team fantasy league, I don't think there's room for Goedert to grow. So I think depending on your league size, Goedert might be a good pick, but he definitely wouldn't be a starting tight end in any league. So now we go to Mike Gesicki, the Dolphins tight end. Last season, Gesicki broke out with 51 receptions, 570 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns. Yes, those don't sound like breakout stats, but the year before he had no receiving touchdowns, so it was a breakout year. This year, I don't care who's starting at quarterback, if it's Tua Tagovailoa or if it's Ryan Fitzmagic. But I think Gesicki is going to improve. He can play all over the field, and he can make catches in the red zone as he proved last season. And he's just a really good option. He helped take down the Patriots last season in their Week 17 game, scored the game-winning touchdown in Foxborough. Yes, I saw that reaction, Brad. So I think Gesicki could be a really good option. Maybe not as a starting tight end, but in that range where I think Hayden Hurst is being drafted, maybe Austin Hooper might be drafted in that range. Chris Herndon. Gesicki could be a really good option with high upside.
Adam, I got to say, this pick is making me sick. I mean, very Gesicki, this pick. But he's a decent backup tight end. That's pretty much what he is in fantasy this year. I think his potential pretty much goes on who's the starting quarterback. I mean, Tua or Fitzpatrick. I think with Tua, he could have a better year because I see Fitzpatrick throwing the ball more downfield to the wide receivers. So right now, Tua is projected to maybe be the starting quarterback. I do like Gesicki more because rookie quarterbacks do like their safety blanket. I think Mike Gesicki could definitely be that this year. So as a backup tight end in fantasy, I agree with Adam. He'd be a good pickup.
Great. Baskin agreeing with me for one time. So these are the tight ends we do not like in 2020. Starting with Brad, we have Jared Cook.
All right. So Jared Cook, early in his career, he wasn't as good as later in his career, obviously. He had the breakout year with the Raiders, and then he went over to the Saints, and he was not bad, but he didn't produce enough to be drafted as one of the top tight ends. And he's very old this year, especially. I don't think he should be drafted where he is, and I think he will dip in production. Especially they added Emmanuel Sanders. Alvin Kamara is still healthy. It's Drew Brees last year, so he is going to want to throw the ball up, but I don't think it's going to be to him. And they also have Michael Thomas, obviously.
Also, to add to that, Cook was super touchdown dependent for fantasy points last year. Yeah. He was all over the place with fantasy scoring. He might have one good week where he had a touchdown and maybe 50 receiving yards, but the next week he was absolutely abominable. So I don't think he is consistent enough to be on your fantasy team.
He'll put up similar production to last year. I mean, the Saints don't really have another tight end to my knowing. I mean, maybe is Josh Hill still there, but
he's still there.
Jared Cook will put up similar production to last year. So if you need a backup tight end, just like Mike Gesicki, I mean, he may not be good if you draft him in a Madden franchise. He may be a little old and regressed, but on a fantasy football team, I think as a backup next year, he's a fine player.
Great. Let's move on to Darren Waller. Maybe a surprise pick here as a bust.
Okay, so with Darren Waller, my thinking here is I think Darren Waller, he could be the making of a one-year wonder. And this seems surprising, but his season came out of completely nowhere. I mean, the Raiders last year, they were a modge podge of I don't know what the Raiders were last year. I mean, they were like 7-9, but they didn't really have an identity. They had Josh Jacobs, so I think they'll continue to run the ball, but they drafted Henry Ruggs, so that's taking away targets from Darren Waller. They still have Tyrell Williams, Jalen Richard. So, and they have a backup tight end, Foster Moreau, who's perfectly capable as a tight end. So I think Darren Waller will definitely hit some regression this year, and I wouldn't really draft him as my starting tight end.
Yeah, I agree with this. Especially, they also have a great defense, which I think will improve Josh Jacobs. Max Crosby and Clelin Ferrell, along with John Abrams, I think they'll just have a lead late in the game this year, that they'll just run the ball and not have to rely on Derek Carr's arm to have to throw it. So I think he'll regress.
I want to agree with Baskin here too. Darren Waller for me here is a boomer bust pick. If he does well, he could be a top 4 fantasy tight end. If he does badly, you might never want to see him again. So I don't think there's enough consistency for him to be a viable tight end option next season. Let's move on to Halbert's tight end here, Austin Hooper.
Okay, so Austin Hooper, he got the big contract with Cleveland, and if you check out the wide receiver video, we talked about how there are too many people there. Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry are there, and so is Nick Chubb. And he did consistently okay in Atlanta, and because he was always right there for Matt Ryan. But now that he's in Cleveland, they have a very reliable running back in Nick Chubb. But I think that's going to take a lot of the short targets away. I just feel like Austin Hooper, he just doesn't really have the potential to be a top 5 tight end.
They also have David Njoku, so that would just be a cause of concern for me when you have 2 starting caliber tight ends. They paid Hooper a load of money. Sorry, Adam, I had to drop something, but they paid him a lot of money and very overpaid. But I think he'll still have some production in that offense, and as a backup tight end, he's still a good pick on your team.
Just adding on what Baskin said about Njoku. He played 4 games last year, and he had 5 receptions and 1 touchdown. Over 4 games, that's not enough. Even Hooper, he is better than Njoku, but to come in and have to take that many more receptions to be viable, I don't think that's going to work.
And finally, I'm going to talk about Jimmy Graham. Don't be fooled by the big name. Jimmy Graham, when he was in New Orleans, if you've watched my Is Jimmy Graham a Hall of Famer video.
Not to give you a shout out.
Please check that out if you haven't. But if you have seen it, you know that he was dominant in Seattle, and he was pretty good in New Orleans too. I think I got that back to front.
I mean, he was very good in New Orleans. That's why he was a good player. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Touchdown threat in Seattle. His prime was in New Orleans. I think Adam obviously knows that.
Exactly. So last season in Green Bay, Graham was absolutely terrible. He caught somewhere around 30 receptions, had barely any touchdowns, barely any receiving yards. He's past his prime. He's now 33 on a Chicago team that, yes, needs a tight end, but Jimmy Graham is not the number 1 tight end there. They drafted Cole Kmet 41st over. I think Cole Kmet will get the majority of targets. Don't be fooled by the big name. Jimmy Graham, just stay away from him. Just please don't.
Just to add, they have 10 tight ends on the roster. So, I mean, yes, a lot of those will be cut, but they just don't know what they're doing right now with tight end. I think they signed him as like a veteran to just, kind of facilitate Kmet this year.
Yeah, don't forget about Adam Shaheen. I mean, as a sleeper 3rd tight end.
I feel like I agree with Adam 100% on this. I feel like they don't really need Jimmy Graham. I don't even know why they haven't. I feel like this year they're just gonna be developing the rookie called Kmet, and Jimmy Graham. He's always been disappointing. It feels like for the past 4 years he's always been drafted much higher than he should be just because it's Jimmy Graham, and he has the goalpost dunk and on.
I think he's just a veteran presence in the locker room. That's why they signed him. That's why the Raiders signed Jason Witten. I mean, he's not really a productive player at this point. He's just more of a locker room guy, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, Witten had a good season last year, so with dunk.
They had to throw the ball to him. They were obligated.
So that is going to wrap it up for us on our tight ends video. Now that you've reached the end of my video, I want to thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe as it helps my channel out. And check out my other videos on my channel. Also, you can follow my Instagram. The link is in the description down below. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, see ya.